Hello, 2BC. Welcome back to our series on disciple making. Over the last several weeks, we've been talking about spiritual growth, and last week we talked about the importance of having a firm foundation and knowing the difference between doctrine and fringe beliefs and false teaching and how to discern between those. And this week, we're going to continue our conversation with a look at the connection between discipleship and leadership. We've spent a lot of time talking about what it means to grow to maturity as followers of Jesus. And part of that is to lead out and to serve the kingdom of God using the gifts that God has given us. And that is an important part of spiritual growth. God does not want us to just sit on the sidelines and be passive observers. He wants us to be involved. And so we're going to talk about that this week, and we're going to look at some passages in the Gospel of Luke to help us do that. And specifically, we're going to be looking at how Jesus discipled his disciples and how they grew from just being called to becoming leaders in the early church. So we're going to look first at Luke 6. And this is the passage where Jesus calls his first disciples. Well, he's already called them because he goes around and says, hey, come and follow me. I'll teach you to be fishers of men. But this is the part where he names them as his disciples, where the 12 becomes the 12. So look with me here at Luke 6, starting in verse 12. We're told that Jesus had gone and spent all night on a mountainside praying, talking to God, communing with God. And it says in verse 13, when morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. Then what we have is a list. So it says Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. And so we have here Jesus calling out these 12 to be more intimately involved in what he is doing. So he has multiple people following him. And we know from reading the Gospels that there were probably hundreds of people who followed Jesus around and wanted to hear him teaching and would have considered themselves followers of Jesus. But here he chooses 12 of them and says, I'm going to choose you 12 specifically. And I always have thought this was interesting because Jesus chooses the 12 after he spends all night in prayer. So Jesus, the Son of God, spent time in prayer before choosing his disciples, choosing the 12. Choosing the ones he was going to invest in very particularly. So these 12 men would be designated to be his close inner circle who were going to follow him everywhere. And if you look with me, flip over to Luke 8, we're going to look at verse 1. It says, Jesus traveled about from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 were with him. And then it also says some other people, women were there and there was a crowd. So we have other people who followed him as well, but the 12 were with him. They had a front row seat to watch how Jesus ministered to people, how he proclaimed the kingdom of God, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. And he would spread this message everywhere he went. And we also know that he would heal the sick and cast out demons and, be involved in the lives of the people he encountered. And the disciples had a front row seat to watch Jesus do ministry. One of the things I was thinking of when I was reading through this passage this week was what must it have been like to be one of the 12 and to have that front row seat, to get to watch Jesus interact with people, to watch him cast out demons, to watch him raise the dead or to heal the blind or the sick, or those who were paralyzed or had leprosy. What would that have been like? Take some time and just imagine that for a minute. Even pause the video and just think about it. What would it have been like to be one of the disciples? And I think a lot of the ways that the disciples learned and grew as followers of Jesus was by watching him, watching how he treated people. I mean, think about all of the people that Jesus spoke to or paid attention to who would have been on the margins of society. And I think that as they watched him do those things, they learned, they took that in and internalized those messages, those ways of being with people and interacting, those ways of proclaiming the good news to everyone. I think as we look through the pages of the New Testament, we see the disciples really take up that mantle and continue doing life and ministry in the way that they were shown by Jesus himself. But Jesus doesn't just teach them and have them follow him around and take good notes or maybe ask good questions, which brings up a good point of I'm sure there were a number of questions that they wish they had asked him while he was walking around on earth. I'm sure once they got to the point where he ascended into heaven, they were like, oh man, I wish I'd ask him this thing. That's also a very fun thought exercise if you want to take the time to do that. But Jesus doesn't just let them learn by watching or by him teaching them. He also sends them out. If you look with me at Luke 9, let's look here in verse 1. It says, when Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. So he sends them out to do what he has been doing, to travel around to the various towns and villages and proclaim the good news of the coming of the kingdom of God and to heal the sick and cast out demons. He sends them out. He appoints them. So first he chose them. They traveled around and they learned from him, and then he sends them out. He has something for them to do. They're not just supposed to sit on the sidelines. They are to be active participants in Jesus's mission. And if we flip over one chapter, we see that Jesus sends out an even larger group of people to go about and proclaim the message. We talked about how there were more than just the 12 who were following Jesus and who were his disciples. And this is one of the passages that shows that to us. It says in verse 1, it says, after this, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. So he sends them out to do very much the same thing. If we look down at verse 17, because he gives them some different instructions and some other things. But if you look down at verse 17, it says the 72 returned with joy and said, Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name. So he sent them out to do very much the same thing that he had sent out the 12 to do in chapter 9. Proclaim the kingdom of God. They very much are preparing the way for Jesus as he is traveling through the countryside to these various villages and towns. They are going ahead of him and preparing the way so that when he gets there, the ground has already been laid and they've already proclaimed a message of the coming of the kingdom of God. And then here comes Jesus. One of the things that stands out to me about these passages is that Jesus equips us and prepares us to do the things that he calls us to do. Sometimes it can be really easy for us to think, oh, I'm not good enough, or I can't do that because I have no experience. I wouldn't be able to do that. But the thing is, if Jesus is calling us to do something, he is going to prepare us. He's going to provide a way for that to happen. He's going to equip us for what he is calling us to do. And so I want to encourage you, because it can be very easy for us to count ourselves out, because often when we look at ourselves, we see the things that are lacking in us. Well, one of the things I have found as I follow Jesus more and more and longer is that he works in all the different areas of my life, but particularly he works in the areas where I feel the weakest. And that is where I experience his power the most. And so what we see here in these passages is that part of growing to maturity in our relationship with God as followers of Jesus is to get to that point where we are actively participating in what God is doing in the world. So we are going out and we're serving. and we are paying attention to what God is doing in our midst, and we are joining him there. So for every single one of us followers of Jesus, God is calling us to be actively engaged in his mission in the world, in proclaiming the good news that he saves, that the Messiah has come and he is coming again. We are all called to participate and to use the gifts and talents that God has given us to serve the kingdom of God. Now, for some people, that looks like being called to serve in ministry in a very formal way, to be a pastor, to be a youth pastor, to lead out in a ministry, to be a missionary. There are some very specific ministry leadership callings that we do see. But for others, it is serving in a ministry. Maybe it's teaching Sunday school or being a leader in vacation Bible school, or playing an instrument and using your musical ability to lead worship, to participate in the worship team, or to sing in the choir. There are so many different ways that we are called to get in the game and get off the sidelines. God gives each one of us gifts and talents and abilities. And so often we focus on, well, I'm not talented, or I'm not creative, or I'm not good at this or that. But God has given each one of us something and has called us to use the things that he has given us for his kingdom. So when we think about this connection between discipleship and leadership, I like to think of it more in the terms of investing in the kingdom of God and being an active participant. It may not necessarily be leadership in what we would normally think of as leadership, as I'm in charge of something, but I am an active member of the family of God, and God has something for me to do. We are not called to be passive observers. To be passive observers is to miss the point of following Jesus. We are called to be active participants in the mission that God has in the world and to join him where he is at work, because he is at work everywhere. And he wants us to participate and join him there. So what is it that God is calling you to do? How does he want you to get in the game? Is there an area of your life, maybe where you're gifted, that God's calling you to use that gift to serve the kingdom of God? Or perhaps he's calling you to teach or lead out in that kind of a way. What is it that God is calling you to do? I encourage you to take some time to reflect on that this week. And that should set us up well for next week's conversation, when we are going to talk about the importance of proclamation and proclaiming the good news. So I hope you'll join me back today. Bye!